I'm going to start by removing the wheel, 19mm socket, remove all of these little caps that hold on your hubcap, if you have steel wheels with hubcaps, that is. Set this aside. Again, 19mm socket, remove all 5 of your lug nuts, and then take the wheel off. Before I move any further, I want to separate the inner and outer tie rod by loosening up on this jam nut. This one's in pretty poor condition, but hopefully it loosens up. You might need a hammer to tap on your wrench. Use a 21mm wrench. There we go. It did break free. If not, you could heat it up using a torch. Now let's loosen up the stud nut for the outer tie rod. Okay, there we go. Lift up on the tie rod end. If yours doesn't come out, you can use a hammer. And then hammer on the knuckle right there. That should pop it out. At this point, you want to unscrew the outer tie rod end, but you want to count the amount of turns that it takes to take it off so that when you put it back on, you can get it close to a decent alignment so that you can drive down to your local alignment shop safely and get yourself a proper alignment. Took 12 turns for me, but of course for you it's going to be different. Next I want to take this mounting nut off so we can take off the inner tie rod. So I'm going to use my 21mm socket, remove it. There we go. If yours is stuck on here, you can either cut it or torch it off or do whatever you have to do. If you follow the inner tie rod, you can see that right here it has a clamp. Remove that clamp. I'm going to throw mine away because it's in poor condition. If yours is still good, go ahead and reuse it. Because of the way that it's positioned, I can't show you this, but there's a clamp. Unfortunately for me, whoever put it on at a weird angle, so I'm going to have to punch it off with a pry bar, which you would do no matter what, but this time it's extra hard to see. Okay, it popped off. Here it is. This is what it looks like, and basically what I did is I just put my pry bar on this piece here, hammered it, popped off. This is a one-time use clamp, so discard that. Now you can grab onto your bellows boot and pop it off of the steering rack and then off of the tie rod. This part might be a little bit tricky. There we go. Next I'm going to use my inner tie rod tool. Mine looks like this. They make multiple types, so whatever you have, go ahead and use that. This one I have to basically clamp down on this inner joint, and it works by biting into it with these little ridges, the splines. And make sure when you position this, if you use one of these, that you give yourself room to spin it. So I'm going to put it on like this so that as I spin it counterclockwise to loosen up the tie rod, it can spin down without hitting the control arm. I'm going to tighten up the 2 mounting nuts and make sure that it bites into the tie rod well. And now I'm just going to use my long breaker bar with some extensions, stick it in here, and break this free. There we go. Because this one's fairly difficult to rotate, and I can rotate it, a lot of times you can't do a full turn with this tool on here, but because I can, I'm just going to use a ratchet and take it off the rest of the way. It's pretty easy to rotate now, so I'm going to go ahead and take my tool off. Okay, and now remove the tie rod. There you have it. Now we're left with the end of the steering rack, and as you can see there's some grease on there, which I'm going to go ahead and clean up. I'm just focusing on the threads where the tie rod actually goes on, not the rest of the rack. That's normal. It actually is supposed to be greased up like that, but over here you want this to be nice and clean. Let's get the new inner tie rod on. Since there's no locking ring on it, I actually put some blue thread locker on the inside of the threads there, just to be safe. And now you just want to go ahead and thread it on. Sometimes it's tricky to do this because, as you can see, this is at an angle, but it looks like I got it. So just go ahead and thread it on the rest of the way till it bottoms out. We'll give it a quick snug, and then we can put the boot back on. Also, remove this nut so that you can put the boot back on. Grab your inner tie rod tool, and let's clamp this down. I'm going to use my ratchet and my extensions and just give it a quick snug. You don't want to twist it far enough to where you're twisting the rack internally. You want to be careful about that. So once it's bottomed out, which is about here, give it about 1/8 of a turn. It's got thread locker on it. It'll be just fine. And now get your tool off. Now this already has a little bit of grease on here, but since it did come with this packet of grease, I'm going to add more to it. When it comes to ball and socket joints like this, you can't really have too much grease. So I'm just going to give it a light coating from what I have in this packet, but I'm not going to use 100% of it because I'll show you in a second. Just go ahead and work this in here. I'm going to use the remaining grease right here where the boot makes contact with the tie rod, and I want to put it here so that the boot, the rubber, doesn't stick to the tie rod. Because when it sticks and your alignment professional turns the tie rod to do the alignment, it will make his job harder because he has to free up the boot so that it doesn't rip. Now get the boot back on, slide it on here onto the rack. I know it went past the notch, but we can bring it back right before the clamp goes on. Right now, I just want to get it onto the steering rack. There we go, it just clicked on, and because I don't have another steel clamp, you can use a wire tie, and I like to use a nice thick one, a wide one. That way it covers up that whole, the entire groove where it's supposed to sit, and it basically simulates that wire clamp there. So I'm going to use my pliers and give it a twist to tighten it better. And now I'll cut off the excess. And I know I said my outer clamp was weak, so I didn't want to reuse it. And in that case, I'm just going to use a wire tie on the outer end as well. It'll be better than a weak clamp, that's for sure. But make sure you pull the boot out to this notch over here where it's supposed to sit. Tighten up the wire tie if you're using that. I'm going to grab my cutters, give it a couple twists to make sure that it's tightened as tight as possible, and cut off the excess. Next, I like to cover these threads in some anti-seize. That way the tie rod and the jam nut don't seize on here in the future, and it helps out your alignment professional. Now let's put on the new jam nut, and I'm just going to drive it on with my air gun so it goes faster. Now you can take your outer tie rod and put it back the same amount of turns that it took to take it off. All right, so here we go. Let's put it back into the knuckle, line it up, press it down, and put on the castle nut underneath. Let's bottom it out and torque it. 18 foot-pounds for this nut right there. And now you want to line up the cotter pin slot with the hole on the stud, and if it doesn't line up, you always want to tighten and not loosen to line it up. I have to go a little bit further for mine. Right there, looks like it's perfect. So let's put in the cotter pin, slide it in, and bend it over to lock it. One last thing that you can't forget is to lock your jam nut up against the tie rod. So use your 21mm wrench, give it a quick snug, just like that. And then I like to straighten the tie rod back out so it's not sitting at an angle here on the knuckle. Let's get the wheel back on. Start on all 5 of your lug nuts, bottom them out, and torque them to 100 foot-pounds. And now if you have hubcaps, go ahead and put those back on and make sure that you line up this hole with the valve stem, otherwise the valve stem will get crushed. Line up all these little caps and thread them on by hand is what I recommend. Otherwise they might strip out and then your hubcap won't be attached properly and it can go flying off the car on the road, and that would not be good. There you go. Take it for a road test down to your local alignment shop.